Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. Enteric methane is one of the huge challenges facing agriculture worldwide. And this morning, we're delighted to be joined by a world-renowned expert on enteric methane and on the science of methane, Professor Frank Mitloehner. Frank, you're very welcome this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You're a professor and air quality specialist at the Department of Animal Science in UC Davis, and I suppose you are known to be outspoken on the issue of enteric methane, and you share your knowledge, I think, across the US and globally with students, farmers, policymakers, and the public at large. And I suppose, is it correct to say that you are striving to get a correct and fair analysis of the role of methane in climate change, and in particular, the role of science, its role, or its the way it's dealt with in science and policy?
Well, absolutely. I think it's critical that for us to be effective in dealing with climate and agriculture is that we get it right. So absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to welcome also Pádraig Foley, who's going to help us with the questions later. So Frank, without too much further ado, I just really want to welcome you, for people to realize that you're in the middle of the night. You're based in California. You're in the middle of the night there. I think it's probably 1:30 in the morning now, if my maths is correct. So really appreciate you getting up to talk to us this morning. So maybe without any further ado, I'll let you give your presentation, and as always, we'll have time for questions and answers after the presentation. So if you have questions for Frank, use the Q&A tab.
So thank you, Pat, for introducing me. I am originally from Europe. I lived in Germany for the first half of my life, here in the United States for the second half of my life, first in Texas, where I did my PhD. And then 22 years ago, I joined the faculty to be a professor and air quality specialist here in the Department of Animal Science. And what you see on this slide is California from space, where I'm pointing here with my mouse. I don't know if you see this moving mouse cursor. That's San Francisco. Down south of my mouse is Los Angeles, where I'm pointing right now. That's Sacramento, and I'm maybe 20 kilometers away from Sacramento. And what you see there in the center, that's the Great Central Valley of California, which is an area that is very agricultural. In fact, while people might associate Hollywood or Silicon Valley with California, we are a very, very agricultural state, the most productive agricultural state in the United States. We have twice as much revenue from agriculture in California as the number one state, which is as the number two state, for agriculture, and that's Iowa. The reason why they hired me, an air quality specialist, 22 years ago is because we have some serious challenges. One is topography. You see here that we have mountain ranges like the Sierra Nevada on the one side, the coastal mountain range on the other, and then this huge valley, which is the most productive farmland in the country, that shows this milky stuff in the middle. And that milky stuff is nothing other than smog. And we have a significant amount of smog here in California, some of which is believed to be associated with agriculture. And so that's why I was hired. If you look at a dairy here in California compared to a dairy in Ireland or in Germany or so, you'll find that our dairies here in California look different. In other words, they look much larger. The dry cows are housed in dry lot corrals with dirt-floored surfaces. The milking cows are housed in freestall barns. You see such a freestall barn on this slide here, where the cows are housed or where they are bedded in freestalls. So you have a kind of soft bed for the cow. Each cow has her own. And then there are these freestall lanes where the animals walk and where they defecate, urinate. And whatever falls off the cow is flushed with water into what's called the lagoon. And the lagoon is the place where the manure is stored. 98% of this lagoon water is water, and 2% is total solids. So the main source of greenhouse gas on a dairy here in California is the cow itself and its enteric emissions, followed by the lagoon where the manure is stored. This here is a slide that I like to use as an icebreaker. It shows the California dairy on the left side of the fence. And on the right side of the fence, you find a recent urban encroachment. These people, these neighbors moved right next to this dairy a few years prior, and they well knew that there was a dairy next door, and they also quickly found out that any kind of dairy would be associated with nuisances such as dust and odors and flies. And but these people moved there anyhow, and the reason why they moved there was because the land was relatively cheap. The first thing after they moved was, no, not complain. They sued the dairy, and that's very typical for California that people move into rural areas, and once they do, they find out that there are conditions that they will experience that they hadn't bargained for. And that's how ag-urban conflict is developing. And I know that you in Ireland are not new to ag-urban conflict. In fact, I've been to Ireland numerous times. I know there are very strong sentiments. There are people who are very pro-dairy and pro-agriculture, and there are also people who are very much against it. So the same is true here in California. But my topic here today is not nuisance conflicts between rural and urban communities, but to talk about greenhouse gases. And here in particular, one greenhouse gas, which is methane gas, and methane because it is the most important one for animal agriculture. The reason why we care about methane and other greenhouse gases is because they form a, let's call it a blanket over the Earth's atmosphere. And just imagine the sun radiating down solar beams to the surface of the Earth. Normally that solar radiation and the heat contained therein would be reflected back into space. If there weren't this blanket of greenhouse gases, gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, these greenhouse gases form an important role. Namely, they help retain the heat or some of it from the sun to be retained in our atmosphere. Without greenhouse gases, life on Earth as we know it would not be possible. It would be too cold. So greenhouse gases are important. But the reason why we have a problem with them is because we are producing too many greenhouse gases, and that makes this blanket too thick, and therefore the retained heat too much. And the thicker the blanket, the more greenhouse gases there are, the more heat we retain in our atmosphere. So most climate scientists would tell you the number one greenhouse gas that we have to be concerned about is carbon dioxide as a result of burning fossil fuels, which are oil, coal, and gas. Methane is a special gas because it is very potent, much more potent per molecule than CO2 is. If you wonder how globally, and I want to emphasize globally, different sectors contribute to greenhouse gases, you'll find here on this slide that one sector, and that is the energy sector, which is transportation, power production and use, energy from buildings and so on. The use of fossil fuel causes energy-related greenhouse gases, and they might make up almost 3/4 of all greenhouse gases in the world. But as you can see in green, agriculture and forestry is also responsible for a good chunk. And there are different estimates with respect to how much livestock contributes to greenhouse gases. The United Nations FAO originally, 10 years or so ago, estimated that livestock emits 18%, 1/8 of all global greenhouse gases. They corrected that after a while from 18 to 14.5. And the most recent estimate is 12% of all greenhouse gases stemming from animal agriculture. In a country like Ireland or Germany or United States, these figures are different. The 12% is just a global figure. When we compare different greenhouse gases to one another, then most often a metric is used called GWP 100, or global warming potential over a period of 100 years. And the factors associated with these different gases are depicted here, namely that one molecule of methane is approximately 28 times more heat trapping, so meaning more powerful than one molecule of CO2. And nitrous oxide even more so, 265 times. So indeed, methane is a powerful greenhouse gas and one that we have to keep a special eye on. But it's also different compared to the others. How so? Well, this slide here summarizes some of it. It shows the global methane budget. On the left side of this budget, you see numerous sources of methane, including fossil fuel production and use, agriculture, biomass, wetlands, and so on. All of these sources amount to a total of 558, let's call it 560 teragrams of this gas. So this is how much methane is produced globally by various sources of methane, oftentimes not reported or ignored is the fact that methane is not just produced by sources, but on the right side, you see there are also sinks. Sinks are those that reduce methane. And here you see that the total sinks globally are 548. Let's call it 550, meaning 560 teragrams of methane are produced by sources globally, and almost 550 teragrams are destroyed by sinks. And as you can see, on the right side, the largest arrow pointing down has as a title, Sink from Chemical Reactions in the Atmosphere. And what that really means is that there are processes that destroy their gas. And that's particularly a process called oxidation. There are so-called radicals in the atmosphere, and they destroy this gas. So if you want to know what the net is of methane globally, you have to subtract the sinks from the sources, and then you arrive at this red box, the number in the red box. That's the net that we have to deal with, and that's the methane that we need to further reduce. Because I want to be very clear about one thing. By no means do I say that methane is not a problem, that we don't have to worry about it because it's naturally destroyed. What's left of methane is still a sizable chunk, and we need to further reduce it. And once we do, we find some very interesting impacts on our climate. So my next slide shows what the fact that methane is not just produced but also destroyed leads to, namely that the half-life of this gas is very short. It's not just produced, it's also destroyed. And that makes methane different compared to CO2 and nitrous oxide. CO2, once in the air, stays there for a long time. These are the years that I have listed on the slide. You can see for carbon dioxide and for nitrous oxide, we are dealing with two long-lived climate pollutants. With methane, we are dealing with a short-lived climate pollutant. It's in the atmosphere for a little over a decade, and then it's gone. While it's there, it's a potent greenhouse gas. Just to give you an analogy, first one for CO2 and how it warms the planet, and then for methane and how that gas warms the planet. So imagine a bathtub. For CO2, that bathtub analogy would be one where you have a bathtub which has a faucet, but it does not have a drain. And whether you turn that faucet on low, medium, or high, the levels of water in that bathtub go up. And they only go up because there is no drain in that bathtub. And this is what it looks like. So when we turn the faucet on normal, the water levels rise. If we turn it on low, then the water levels still rise because there's no drain in there. Okay? The water levels always go up whether you turn the water faucet on low, medium, or high. So that's how CO2 warms the planet. Now comes CH4, and that is methane. Here, you have a faucet, but you also have a drain, and the drain is always open, standing for the natural removal of this gas. If you turn the faucet on, if you turn the faucet on normal, then an equal amount of what goes in is also that gone out of, and that's leading to constant amounts of, in this case, water level. If you turn the faucet down, then more water is let go of than replenished through the faucet. So if you turn the faucet on low, then more water is let go of than replenished. And that means, in the case of methane, if we reduce methane, then we are replenishing less methane to our atmosphere than the natural removal is taken out of the atmosphere. And that means we are now reducing carbon emissions, and therefore we are reducing warming to our atmosphere. So in other words, if we effectively reduce methane, then we are reducing warming. If we, however, increase methane, and that would be the equivalent of turning that faucet all the way up, then we would put more water into that bathtub than we let go of. And then we are increasing warming. To give you another little depiction of this from my colleagues from Oxford University, Miles Allen and colleagues, they have shown what happens when you increase by two different sources, the one CO2, the other one methane on the top. If you increase both of them linearly, then you'll see the warming of both is going up. In the case of CO2, it goes up even exponentially. But if you have a linear increase of methane, you have a linear increase of warming at the bottom. Here you see what happens if you hold both a CO2 source and a methane source stable. If you don't increase them over time, but you hold both stable, then at the bottom you see that the stable methane source from on top causes stable warming. No increased warming, but stable warming. But if you have a stable source of CO2, you have an increased amount of warming. However, and this is the most exciting part of this slide to me, what happens if you reduce both CO2 and methane over time to reduce our impact on warming? Well, let's start with the red scenario on the right side. If you reduce CO2, then at the bottom side, at the bottom panel, you see that even though we are reducing CO2 on top, and that's the red, at the bottom, the related warming still goes up and up and up and up until the time you turn off that CO2 source. So let's say turn off the power plant. At the time that you do that, you turn off that power plant, then the related warming will plateau, will no longer increase or decrease, it will plateau. But that's what it takes. You have to go to net zero for CO2 emissions to not add additional warming to our planet. And that is how drastic this gas is. Even though it's less potent than methane, it is long-lived. And if you now look at methane in blue, you see that a reduction of methane leads, and at the bottom you see it, to a reduction in warming. And that is a real opportunity because methane is the main greenhouse gas in animal agriculture. And if we learn to manage it, in other words, if we learn to reduce it, then we are reducing the related warming. So the question now becomes, is that possible? Is it something that we can do? And the answer to that is yes, we can. This slide here is a slide that shows all methane sources from throughout the world. And you can see there are many sources: coal mining, rice cultivation, landfills, oil, gas, and in light blue, enteric fermentation and manure from livestock. And again, that's global. On the y-axis, you see methane emissions. And now I animate that. What you see here in blue, that is the responsibility of our livestock. Okay? Enteric fermentation is what they belch, and the manure is clear. That's what comes out the other end. So what you see here in blue is caused by our livestock friends. This slide here shows different livestock species: cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats, pigs, and chicken throughout the world. And it shows very clearly who the main culprit of these greenhouse, in particular methane, is. The main culprit is ruminants, and here in particular cattle. Buffalo also play a role, sheep and others do, but cattle are the number one. And here in particular, enteric fermentation, that's the process by which they belch out methane that was produced in the rumen of these animals. That is the main issue we are dealing with, producing methane gas. There are some people who say, well, what we really should focus on is the methane, sorry, not the methane, is we should focus on consumption, hope that people consume less meat, milk, and so on. But the reality is a different one. When we look throughout the world, we see that the consumption of animal source foods such as meat, milk, eggs, and so on is not decreasing, not even in Europe, where that's heavily propagated or promoted, but it is increasing. In Europe, consumption of animal source foods is plateauing. In the Americas, it's increasing, particularly because of Latin America. In Africa and particularly Asia, consumption of animal source foods are drastically increasing. So in reality, we have to really think about how we deal with environmental liabilities of the livestock sector in times that the sector is growing. It's not going down, it's going up. So what do we do to mitigate the related environmental issues? We have to do that during a time that human population is increasing, and drastically so. You see here Southeast Asia increasing human population by over 40%. Africa is increasing human population by over half or almost half. The Americas are increasing human population, but slightly so. And the Europeans are, by 2050, slightly shrinking. But we do have food security issues in parts of Asia, in parts of Africa that are significant. This is one of my favorite slides. It shows a circle over Southeast Asia. And inside this circle, there are more people than in the rest of the world combined. Clearly, one of the areas of food security in the years to come. And those areas are of significant particular to countries like yours, which are heavily export-oriented. There are places in the world where food is not taken for granted, but where food is really a limited resource. And places like yours are contributing to food security in those parts of the world. I just told you we have a drastic increase of human population. I'm in my mid-50s. When I was a little boy, we had 3 billion people in the world. Today we have 8. And by the time I'm an old man, we'll have 9.5 billion people in the world. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, throughout my lifetime, human population will have tripled. We'll have 3 times more mouths to feed by the time we're old compared to when we were young. When, at the same time, the land we have available globally to grow crops to feed people is not increasing, certainly not by a factor of 3. In fact, 2/3 of all agricultural land cannot be used to grow crops at all because it's marginal land being land much like much of Ireland that is not suitable to grow crops, but that is suitable to grow grasses or other commodities that grow cellulose, the world's most abundant biomass. And here you see in color the only places in the world where we have arable land. Thank God we have also marginal land where only grass grows. And thank God that we have ruminant livestock that can make use of it, because without our ruminant friends, we would not be able to make use of 2/3 of all agricultural land, which is marginal. So particularly recently, the question has become, what are those pathways or what are those tools that we can deploy in order to reduce emissions from animal agriculture? And that question becomes more and more important, particularly because we become more and more resource limited with increasing number of people and stable or decreasing amounts of resources. Some people say we need to change what we eat. This data here is from the United Kingdom, and it shows the trajectory of different dietary choices. We see on top here meat eaters, and these are not carnivores, these are omnivores. You can see that in the UK, the consumption of, meat eaters, the omnivores, have not really gone down. Their numbers are pretty much plateauing, as are those of people who are flexitarian, who eat animal source foods, but only sometimes, not every day. And you also see vegetarians and vegans and pescatarians and so on, all the other nutritional forms down at the bottom. While people promote that we all should eat something else that we currently don't, particularly plant-based dietary forms. The reality is those consumption patterns have not been changed in any major way over the last few years, and they're not going to, in my opinion. People eat what they eat because of many, many reasons, religious, cultural, and so on and so on. An issue like climate is not really changing the way that people eat in any major way. And that really begs the question, if the consumption is not the lever that we can use effectively, can we do it with production? Can our farmers help? Before I went to the COP28 in Dubai, the news was full with articles like this. Eat less meat. That is the most important message of a report that's about to be released. That's what the world's media was full of. And that was right before the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization released what the media called landmark report, called the Pathways Report. So before this Pathways FAO report was released, the world's media said it will say, once it is released, that we just need to change our diet to a plant-based diet, and that's the way to move forward. I was really curious when I read these articles, because that was not the impression I got from working with the FAO, which I have done extensively over the last few years. So I was at the COP28 and the FAO was, and the report was released. And I want to talk to you about what that report showed. This is what the report looks like, pathways toward lower emissions. This QR code here allows you to look at the report. This is the way to get the report. Again, in short, it's called the Pathways Report, and I read it with great interest. Why? Because I have learned to appreciate that the FAO puts a lot of resources, a lot of manpower into assembling these reports, and this particular one is one that shows that there is no silver bullet in reducing emissions from livestock. They looked at all the different ways that we can achieve a reduction of the environmental footprint, particularly the carbon footprint of livestock. And here's what it said. This slide I know is pretty busy, but I will lead you through it. On the x-axis, you see different scenarios to reducing emissions. On the y-axis, you see total greenhouse gas emissions. The column most left to you shows base year emissions, and that's pretty much the livestock emissions globally that we find currently. The second column shows the livestock-related emissions that will occur until the year 2050 if we don't mitigate further. So the first column and the second column amount to the third column, which would be the projected 2050 emissions from the livestock and poultry sector if business were as usual, as if we weren't reducing emissions. And then all the way to the right, you see the projected 2050 emissions that the United Nations FAO is seeking the livestock sector to achieve if various forms of mitigations occur. So again, the third column is what happens if we have business as usual, nobody mitigates, nobody reduces emissions. All the way to the right, that is the projected goal where we want to go. And then those little steps in between show how various tools that we have at our disposal can help us achieve that right scenario, the projected 2050 goal emissions. And so what this report shows is that there are different ways of reducing emissions. The most important one you see pointed here by my mouse. The number one is productivity increases. The number two is better breeding. The number three is improved animal health. Then there are others like carbon sequestration and so on. You see all the different ones. Some are more effective than other, and all of them added up. So if you stack them on top of each other, amount to a pretty significant reduction all the way to the right scenario. What I found also very interesting was that what the world media tooted right before COP28, namely that what we need to do, particularly in developed countries, which is change our diet from the current omnivore diet to a plant-based diet is not the most effective thing we can do. But as you can see in the fourth column, it's titled Dietary Changes. The fourth column shows what would happen if people in developed countries were to move from animal source diets to plant-based diets. It's not the most effective, it's the second least effective way to reducing the impact of our animal agricultural sector and produce and consume less animal source foods. I thought it was very insightful because the world media had depicted exactly the opposite of what this landmark report has actually stated. I can tell you from my perspective, what this report has stated is exactly what we have been saying for the last, I don't know how many years, namely that we need to work with our farmers, work on better productivity, work on better breeding, better health, better feeding, and so on these different tools that you see here in order to minimize emissions. Work with farmers and not against them if you want the agricultural sector to reduce emissions. That is the take-home message of this FAO report, and I 100% agree with it. I have a few more minutes here, maybe 5 more that I want to emphasize the route that we have taken here in California, because it's an interesting case study. Here in California, we have various sources of methane. They are depicted in this pie chart. You can see the dairy and the livestock sector make up a significant part of the pie. Our goals on methane are very ambitious. We want to reduce 40%, 40, of methane from the dairy and livestock sector by the year 2030. It's the most ambitious climate goal, methane goal in the world. This 40% reduction amounts to 7.2 million metric tons for the dairy sector, 1.8 million metric tons to the beef and other livestock sectors. So that's the goalpost in California, to reduce 7.2 for the dairy sector, 1.8 for the beef and other livestock. What we have found, 2 of my colleagues, Dan Sumner, Ermis Kibriab, and I, in a report to the legislature, is that we are very well suited to achieve the total reduction. Again, for the dairy sector is 7.2. In reality, we will achieve anywhere between 7.6 to 10.6 million metric tons of reduction of methane. How? 4 major ways. The first one is due to increasing productivity of our cows, we have a slight attrition, meaning shrinkage of our herd by about 0.5% per year. Some people say it's up to 1% per year. That reduction of herd size leads to a reduction of methane-related greenhouse gases in a range of 2.6 to 3.3. We have alternative manure management practices such as solid separators and so on. They will lead to a relatively smaller reduction of a range of 0.6 to 1.1. The most important technology we have currently at our disposal are dairy digesters. They will amount to 4 million metric tons of methane reductions. And very soon, starting next month, we will have at our disposal feed additives to reduce methane, and they will amount to anywhere between 250,000 to 2 million metric tons of CO2e reductions. So if you add all these ranges up, you will come up with a total range of 7.6 to 10.6. Earlier, when I was asked to talk to the Irish a few years ago, those people in Ireland who don't really like the livestock sector very much thought that some of those numbers I cited were too ambitious. Those people were simply put incorrect. These numbers are not just not ambitious. These numbers have now been verified. They are verified, particularly for things such as dairy digesters, where the gases that are reduced are being metered. So the state of California has now confirmed that our dairy sector alone has reduced 3 million metric tons until now, and due to attrition, an additional 1 million metric tons. So we already, by now, have reduced our carbon footprint by 4 million metric tons. The goal, again, is 7.2 for dairy. So we have achieved over half of our methane reduction goal. So 30% is just the use of digesters, dairy digesters. You see on this slide here a dairy, what used to be a lagoon that was open and off-gassing biogas, the mixture of gases into the air, is now oftentimes covered. And what you see bulging out is biogas, 60% of which is methane. That's now not going into the air, but it's being trapped and converted into vehicle fuel and or power. That technology has been found to be very effective, capturing a lot of the biogas and related greenhouse gases that would come off those manure storages. That biogas is turned into fuel, renewable natural gas, we call it, RNG, and then oftentimes put into heavy-duty trucks and into buses to fuel those vehicles, which now run on this much cleaner renewable natural gas and no longer on diesel. This one technology, I want to remind you of the numbers, has led to very significant methane reductions, which will amount by the year 2030 to a total of 4 million metric tons. And if you consider that our goal is 7.2, then 4 million metric tons from this one technology alone is no small change. With respect to additional technologies, we have found that there are feed additives that can be used to reduce methane. Some of these feed additives have desirable, but also undesirable impacts. So we have to be careful. It's not just about reducing enteric methane, the methane that animals belch out. It's also to make sure the animals don't perform less, have less milk yield or components, as well as that there are no toxicological and other issues. We do find that there are now some feed additives that will reduce anywhere between 5 and 30% enteric methane. It's theoretically possible to reduce more, but if you go higher in your methane reduction from enteric, you might run into issues of palatability, that cows just eat less, and that's not something we want. So methane will not just be reduced from manure, it will be reduced from enteric. Not just feed additives can be used, but I find other technologies interesting as well, such as breeding. Methane is a heritable trait. You can now breed for low methane producing cows. In the future, I think we will also have other technologies such as vaccines, for example, that will help us to reduce enteric methane from animals. If you are interested in the journey that we have taken here in California, I alluded to that before. Professors Dan Sumner and Ermis Kabriap and I submitted this report to the California legislature and agencies. It's called Meeting the Call. This is a report that you'll get if you take a photo of this QR code that tells you the whole story that we have taken. We are very pleased with the progress that we have seen here, and not just with the progress we have seen, but also with the fact that many stakeholders from throughout the world, including your country, are coming here to a place like ours to see what we have done. We have just finished a summit. It's called the State of the Science Summit here at UC Davis, where we had close to 400 attendees to learn and share lessons learned with respect to how we can reduce particularly methane from the animal agricultural sector. This is a slide here that shows a peer-reviewed article on other ways of reducing enteric methane. I'd be glad to leave the presentation with you so that you can share it with anyone who's on the call. So in closing, while there are people, particularly in the media, who feel that all we need to do is change what we eat, it's not really going to happen. Okay, so this wave of education and re-education has pretty much subsided, and it has led to very little change. The change or the wave of people saying, let's just change what we eat. Have we seen a reduction of animal source foods? Not really in most places. except for very few European countries. In most of the world, we have not seen a decrease in consumption, but a plateauing or increase of consumption. I am 100% in agreement with the United Nations FAO that there is no silver bullet to reducing emissions, but indeed that there's a toolbox of solutions. And much like a toolbox that you need with multiple tools to build a house, you can't just build a house with a hammer or a screwdriver, you need multiple tools. So do our farmers. They need multiple tools to reduce emissions and get the work done they need to get done. We also, and that's also very important, need to reconsider what it's worth to us as society to reduce emissions and what it's worth to support those entities that study ways to reducing emissions to doing their job. Because quite frankly, what the world is putting into research to investigate what works, what doesn't, and how we can help our farmers is dismal, and in my opinion, needs to be changed. So with that, just wanted to point out the Clear Center that I'm directing is putting out a lot of information in the form of explainers, blogs, news stories, and so on. You will find us there on all kinds of stories and issues related to digesters, feed additives, soil carbon sequestration, and so on and so on. And this is the webpage, clear.ucdavis.edu, that you need to enter if you try to find us. If you have any questions, I'm very excited to talking to you now, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. A very clear presentation and very thorough. You mentioned in one of the slides, or you showed in one of the slides, the different sources of methane across different sectors. I know it's not specifically your area of expertise, but in terms of what's happening in those other sectors in terms of growth or contraction, is there an equivalent level of work being done to try and mitigate the other sources, or is that something that's increasing all the time?
So are you referring to California or worldwide?
No, worldwide.
There is work related to other sectors. For example, on the agricultural side, in addition to ruminants, rice production is a significant source of methane, and there's work being done. The United Nations FAO has put in a report that is called the Methane Report. If you Google FAO and biogenic methane, you will find a report. I was one of the co-authors of that report that deals with methane emissions from livestock and rice. So that is certainly something that's being looked at. There's also some focus into, let's say, landfills and other anaerobic, meaning oxygen-deprived sectors that lend themselves into producing methane.
Pádraig, a lot of questions starting to come in there. I'll remind people
I'd say
if you have questions for Frank to put them in the questions and answers.
Yeah, be prepared to go over time, Pat.
Okay.
So, Frank, first question. In that FAO report, it outlined that farmer breeding better and having better productivity increases would lead to obviously a reduction in methane over time. But in general, the sentiment among the farming community in Ireland anyway would be that if you can increase, then you increase output to maintain, I suppose, your level of income and stay on top of inflation and the inflationary costs of inputs. How can farmers be rewarded to avoid them doing that and reap the rewards of increase or better breeding and better productivity increases?
So it is one thing of doing what we do better, okay, by having better productivity, let's say producing more milk with fewer cows and so on. All of that is very important. It describes what we call methane intensity, which is producing less methane per unit of milk or meat produced. And that's something we need to continue to do, but we also need to reduce absolute emissions, meaning the entire emissions of the sector. And we can do that by producing more and relatively needing fewer animals. That will reduce emissions over time. That's the attrition I was talking about. But there are other avenues, and I talked about feed additives, and I talked about digesters and so on. The way that we do this in California, and that is different compared to the rest of the world, is that our legislature decided that we need to use a different approach compared to what was used originally. Instead of using the cane approach, of using rules and regulations, fines, maybe taxes, instead of using that cane approach, we are using the carrot approach of using a voluntary incentive-based approach, meaning we tell farmers, we're not telling you what to do. We are telling you we need to reduce emissions, but how you do it is your choosing. But if you do reduce methane, you will be incentivized. There will be a cap and trade market from where there will be resources that you will be given if you reduce emissions. Meaning, if you, let's say, put in a digester and you convert the biogas that comes from your lagoon into vehicle fuel, then you will get carbon credits for that. And these are sizable amounts. They used to be very high, and now they are much lower, but still sizable. In the future, in my opinion, there will be members of the supply chains, companies like Nestle and Starbucks and others that are at the end of the supply chain, and their Scope 3 emissions, so meaning the emissions associated with these companies, are largely influenced by the farmers' emissions who developed products that they sell. And if the Nestle's and Starbucks want to reduce their emissions, they need to help the farmers that supply them with their products to reduce their emissions. And so these companies buy, let's say, feed additives, and they give them to farmers to be used. In the future, I think there will be many of these cases where the end users of what comes from farming will pay farmers to reduce emissions, because if the farms reduce emissions, then they do as well through.
That's great. That answers one of the other questions, which was what did you mean by incentivized based dairy methane reduction? So that's that one answered. I'm going to combine, we've only 10 minutes left, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions. There's a number of questions that have come in relation to the CO2 in the atmosphere, obviously the half-life of methane and its conversion to CO2. Are you taking that into account? Because you're saying that the CO2's half-life is reduced, but that's turned into CO, or sorry, the CH4 is reduced, so that's turning into CO2. Are you taking that into account? And secondly, are you using GWP 100 or GWP star in your calculations?
So in what I just presented to you, I use GWP 100, not because I think it's a great metric. I don't think so, but because the world uses it and the world will continue to use it. I think a much more scientifically valid metric, and you've heard me say that before, I'm sure, is GWP star. I will always use this in parallel because I think it gives us a much clearer view as to what our sector's impact on actual warming is. And actual warming is what we care about. That's why we care about greenhouse gases. But what I just presented to you was using GWP 100. And the reason for this is that the goals that were set forth by agencies to our farmers were based on GWP 100. So I have to use the same goalpost as those agencies that are in power to make up goals, because these are the goals that our farmers have to live by.
Okay. A question on the slurry. I have three questions that I'm going to put together for this. One person is absolutely shocked and horrified that the slurry is pumped into a lagoon and the impact that that might have on water quality. Can you just give a brief outline on how that is treated before is spread on land, I presume, for crops, and maybe how the water quality is safeguarded? Secondly, then, what percentage of the slurry is now processed using anaerobic digestion? And also, is that anaerobic digestion being sponsored by government, or are farmers having to pay out hard-earned cash to try and set up their own business in that area?
Okay, so many questions there. So
just three, Frank.
So the manure that comes from the barns, from the freestall barns, is diluted with water from the milking center. So when we wash the cows, that water goes eventually into the lagoon. The lagoon water consists of 98% water and 2% solids. And the solids, of course, that's the manure material. So that that overall body of manure storage is anaerobic and therefore lends itself for methane production. Before the manure gets into the lagoon, in most cases, it's it's going through a solid separator, meaning the solids are separated from the liquids, and then the liquids go into the lagoon. The solids are stacked, dried, oftentimes used as organic bedding. Whereas the liquids go into the lagoon, they stay there for several months and are eventually used to flood irrigate surrounding fields. So that's what happens with the lagoons, and it's a very typical way of storing and dealing with lagoon water, with manure. Digesters, we have currently around 200 of these covered lagoons in California. At this point, we are reducing close to 3 million metric tons of CO2e by using digesters. Most of that biogas is going into vehicle fuel, such as renewable natural gas that goes into heavy-duty trucks and buses. In the future, I think that much of the biogas will go into things such as hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very interesting form of energy that is very versatile. I would say that in 5 years from now, half of the manure that's coming out of our cows will make it through some kind of anaerobic digestion, and then the outcome will be either vehicle fuel or power directly.
And is that taken account of just within the agricultural sector, or does it move on to the transport sector then after that, or is the transport sector emission reductions also accounted for in your calculations for agriculture?
Yeah, this is the really interesting thing about anaerobic digestion, that the state considers this technology as a double whammy, because you're reducing emissions from the farm by capping the lagoon and preventing something that normally would emanate from the lagoon into the air. But it also reduces transportation sector emissions, because burning diesel is much more dirty than burning renewable natural gas. So in addition to having a lower environmental footprint of the farm itself, you now also have a lower environmental footprint of the transportation sector. That's why it's a double whammy. And that's why the state likes it.
Okay, good stuff. And as regards the state, one of the other questions, the final question in those three was, are the state sponsoring these buildings of anaerobic digestion, or they are?
Right. So initially, anaerobic digesters received grants from the state. There were about 400 million or so dollars that went to the dairy industry as grants. That's 2%. 2% of the total public investment to reduce methane went into the dairy sector, 2%. But that 2% public dollar investment led to 30%, 30, of the state's publicly funded methane reductions. So that's a 15x return on investment, one that got really the attention of our legislature and of our main agencies. So a really good return on investment. Most of the digesters are not owned by dairies. They're owned by the dairy digester developers. And these dairy digester developers pass on some of the revenues to the dairies, and they pay the dairies a fee for their manure, but they are dealing with the manure and give back the nutrients so that the dairies can then apply the nutrients as fertilizer to their crops. But before they return that, they suck out the energy and sell the credits to the markets.
Another question then on a slightly different tone, but very important. I guess you kind of insinuated that, and maybe I'm misinterpreting what you were saying, that the Pathways report was somewhat misunderstood or misinterpreted by the general media. You showed that Bloomberg headline, and they obviously hadn't read it in as much detail as you have. So that kind of leads to a question that has come directly in that says that farmers are increasingly getting defensive regarding climate change as they are consistently painted as the bad guys. How can we better bridge the gap between research and practice adoption? And how can we
I have to tell
change the
you,
sentiment?
I'm sorry. I have to tell you, I'm equally frustrated because I think that our farmers and farmers throughout the world really are getting a bad rap. And a bad rap in times when they are particularly critical in our fight against a changing climate, where we need them to be part of it. And I think the one thing that they deserve from us as society is that they get a fair shake. That is what they really deserve. Okay, I don't want them to be treated in any different way, but they deserve a fair shake, and they're currently not getting it. The reporting I saw before the FAO report came out throughout the world was drastically unfair, and it was drastically inaccurate. What the world media depicted this FAO report to say was 100% not what it did say. It was not what it did say. And after the so-called landmark report came out, that was announced by so many, the BBC, the CNN, Bloomberg, and others, after it came out, nobody talked about it anymore because its content was not what the narrative generally is. Because who wants to talk about the great advantages of productivity increases or better breeding or better healthcare of animals? They didn't want to talk about that, and so they didn't report upon it. But this is the stuff that we need to do to lower the environmental footprint of livestock. By the way, particularly in developing countries,
So at the
because
COP
that's
meetings,
also
Frank, you're brushing shoulders with the guys and girls that are making the decisions around policy. Is this discussed? Is the sentiment from the general public or from the media towards farming and from towards agriculture discussed at those high level meetings?
it is discussed. Absolutely. Yes, it is discussed. The farmers are not alone in this, okay? I just had a meeting here with 400 people. Many of them were agency people. Some of them came from Ireland. They came here to UC Davis, and we discussed those issues because we need farmers at the table. We need farmers being actors in our fight against a changing climate. And without their buying, without them working on it, we will have an uphill battle. So rather than accusing them of things, we want them to be productive and at the table. And we need to, as society, support our farming sector to do their share.
Okay, and to bring it back home to Ireland, so farmers can help do their share a little more. Our grazing system is very different to what you have presented in California. How can additives help us, or what? Obviously, productivity is ongoing. We're very lucky to have ICBF and Teagasc doing the wonderful work that they're doing to help the increases. What else would you see that Irish farmers can do in your visits?
So, in general, grazing systems are the most challenging ones throughout the world because, particularly beef, because you don't get your hands on those animals every day in many cases. So, if you have animals that roam around freely and you see them twice or four times a year, then feed additives won't work. But there are some other solutions. One of the solutions is, I think, a very interesting one, and that's related to the fact that methane is a heritable trait. Last week I was in Japan and I talked to the world's breeders, and they are working on, we call it EPDs, expected progeny differences, so indicators that are associated with enteric methane, so that you can breed for low methane producing cows and sheep and so on. I think that will be something that we will have within the next 5 years, a selection for low methane producing animals. The New Zealanders, who are similar to you in Ireland, are working on a methane vaccine, and they seem to be around 5 years from having that. That would be very interesting. And last not least, there are boluses developed, capsules that you put into the rumen of an animal, slowly releasing an anti-methanogenic agent that reduces that gas. Those are solutions that could work under grazing conditions. If you don't graze, if you have animals, let's say dairy animals that you milk several times a day or so, then you can also make use of, for example, feed additives.
Pat, I guess
Okay,
that's time.
yeah, I think so. And just slightly over time, but well worth it. Listen, thank you very much, Frank, for a really insightful presentation and I suppose succinct and really accurate answering of questions as well. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us. It's now 2:30 in the morning there where you are. So I don't know how much more of the night you're going to get to sleep, but really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us. And that pint of Guinness that you said is the price. The next time you're over, we would be absolutely delighted to meet you and supply that. So
I will not forget. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you in Ireland.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And just to say thanks to Yvonne and Pádraig for their help this morning. And next week we have David Dolan, and David Dolan is a farmer and Nuffield scholar. And following on from today, he'll be talking about net zero carbon emissions, the challenges for farmers and co-ops. So very much a follow on from the topic of today. So again, I think our audience have shown their appreciation, a lot of comments in terms of the clarity of your presentation and what people have learned from it. So thanks once again, and until next week, goodbye.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.